While the fight against ISIS continues in one part of the world, more and more national security experts are urging America to wake up. America must wake up because China is a real threat, they say. What's behind these warnings, and what, if at all, is Washington's response? Joining me now from Washington is James J. Carafano. He's with the Heritage Foundation. He's also vice president for the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy, and a retired lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. Here with us in studio is my old friend, the Pulitzer and Emmy Award-winning journalist Peter Arnett. He covered the Vietnam War for the Associated Press, later went on to win wide acclaim for his war coverage when he was with CNN. He's also taught journalism in China, and he's the author of the new book, Saigon Has Fallen, and he's just back from a 3-week return to Vietnam. All right, U.S. military officials are insisting that ISIS is on the defenses, even as the city of Ramadi has fallen. What's your reaction to that, James?
Well, it's certainly not good news. I got to tell you, I just met with an Iraqi delegation a couple of days ago, and there was a pretty healthy discussion about, well, after we take our country back from ISIS, what are we going to do? What's the future? How are we going to deal with Iran? What's the relationship between Iran and the United States? How are we going to deal with Syria? So here was a bunch of officials who were kind of looking beyond this. So I think certainly they were caught by surprise. You can't argue this is good news.
Peter?
Well, I think the only good news I can see here, Larry, is that a year ago there was concern that Baghdad itself may fall to ISIS, but that possibility has passed. So at least the capital of Baghdad is safe, secure, and you've got American bombing and American advisors in that locale. The fact that Ramadi did indeed fall is really a symbolic, strategic blow to the government of Prime Minister Haider Badr, because he's been saying for months that ISIS was on the run, and clearly ISIS has been on the run, but towards the capital of a major Iraqi province, which is Ramadi.
James, you wrote a piece published in the National Interest that was headlined, "Wake Up America, China is a Real Threat." In it you say current U.S.-China policy isn't working. First, what's the policy generally, and what's not working?
Right. Well, I think the notion is the policy of engagement, but I think it's how you do that engagement. You know, I got to tell you, I hated that title. You know, as you know, and as Peter knows, you know, we don't often get to pick the title of our articles. I think looking at the U.S.-China relationship as in a kind of a traditional way that we did, for example, with the Soviet Union, where as a national security threat that you're measuring up against in a kind of a traditional, you know, we're on our side of the trench, you're on our side of the trench, is tremendously unhelpful when thinking about China. I think we have a competition with China. We have a process of engagement. And my work really focuses on is how do you have that relationship coexist without increasing friction and tension. So the notion of kind of looking at China as an enemy, you know, as you know, Washington is famous. We have two tribes here. We have the panda huggers, which are people that say everything's fine. If you make nice with China, all the problems will go away. And you have the panda huggers, or the panda haters, who think, you know, want to treat China like a traditional threat, kind of like the new Soviet Union. I think they're both wrong. I think what you have to do is have a policy of engagement with China that's realistic, and when you've clearly stated your interests and more importantly, demonstrated the willingness to protect and secure those interests, and use that as the basis for the ongoing relationship with Beijing.
Peter?
I can understand the concern, Larry, because China has emerged as basically the next great power. Now, that doesn't mean to say that by emerging it pushes the United States aside. But I would agree that the idea of viewing China as an enemy is just not really valid. For example, the relationships between the United States and China are unique, nothing like the Cold War era when the Soviet Union wouldn't let any students or citizens even visit the United States. There are 200,000 Chinese students studying in the United States each year. There's many thousands of Americans in China itself. The trade relationship with this between really the world's two biggest economic powers is really strong. So I don't see China really threatening the United States, which is its biggest market. And I would agree that while China is emerging, it's a rising power, that in the past there have been conflicts between rising powers and actually existing powers, that a constructive way of looking at China realistically is the way to go.
All right, James, what do you make of what Peter had to say?
Well, Peter brings up this really interesting point about great power relationships. And in fairness to people in Washington, D.C., most of them have never in their lifetime seen a traditional great power relationship. The only thing we've ever seen is the United States and the Soviet Union kind of black and white poised off against each other. But really, for example, most of the 19th century, great powers had this mix of confrontation and cooperation, and it wasn't clearly, you're my enemy, you're my friend. Matter of fact, countries often changed alliances many times. So what we're actually seeing today is kind of more traditional of how large powers interact with each other than not. And I think most people just kind of don't get that.
You don't see U.S. and China ever coming to battle, do you, James?
Well, my purpose in life is to try to make sure that never happens. I do worry about that because this is one difference between the Cold War and now that's actually makes life a little more troubling. Part of the reason why the United States and the Soviet Union could coexist so easily is we didn't do business with each other. There were no interactions. We lived on our fence side. They lived on their side of the fence. We never really talked to each other. So it was kind of easy to kind of keep relations going. But, if you remember, in 1914, two of Germany's largest trading partners were England and France. The reality is when your powers are integrated together in a global market and you're exchanging goods and services and people, that creates friction as well as interchange. And if you don't really tend those relationships very carefully, you can wind up in some bad places. So I do worry about China's rise balancing with the presence. And maybe Peter and I disagree on this, but this is what I fundamentally see as a problem. I do believe that the Chinese long-range vision is essentially mercantilistic. The notion that they're going to secure their eternal prosperity and security by, in a sense, being the dominant power in Asia. And I think part of that vision really requires the United States to kind of leave Asia as a great power. And I think America is fundamentally an Asian power and always will be. And the Chinese are going to have to learn to live with that. And so I think our job is to get through the next 20 years with the Chinese having to recognize that the United States is in Asia and always will be.
Peter, you agree?
Well, we must remember that the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is really the man who is causing a lot of this concern. He's forceful, ambitious, he's an effective leader. Some experts believe he's the most prominent Chinese authority figure since Mao Zedong, who died in the late 1970s. It is his vision that sees, that is what he calls achieving the Chinese dream. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, China wants the United States out of the Pacific or out of Asia. We know that is not going to happen. United States' relationship with Japan and with Taiwan, the emerging relationship with Vietnam and the Philippines, they will be permanent. And the U.S., clearly President Obama and future presidents will make sure that they're a Pacific power.
That Trans-Pacific Partnership, Peter, the trade deal pushed by Obama, if it goes through, how does it impact China's economic and political clout? Because that trade agreement includes the United States, Japan, 10 other economies, but not China.
Well, what they call the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, is seen as a sort of rebalancing act of the United States in Asia to sort of balance against the Chinese economic power and authority in that region. And the concern was that the U.S. might be elbowed out of Asia. Now, the Chinese looked at that as the U.S. simply trying to contain China's economic development and opposed it. But in fact, other analysts and experts are now saying that maybe China would be willing to participate to some degree. There are 16 Asian countries in the TPP, and maybe bringing China aboard at some point in the future would be a way of basically neutralizing these threats within the Pacific and allowing everyone to become rich.
James, China and Russia recently signed a pact of a lot of trade agreements, and China's president was seated next to Putin on the reviewing stand at this month's May Day celebrations and V-Day celebrations in Moscow. How real is that rapprochement between those two countries?
Well, first, that's China's problem. I mean, I think Russia's got lots of issues, and the closer integration between the Russia and the Chinese economy actually just means China buys into those problems. I don't think Russia really has a lot to offer China. I think at the end of the day, there'll still be the traditional tensions in the Middle East. So all looks good on paper. Geostrategically, don't think it changes much. Kind of agree with Peter. I think the unsung story on TPP is I think the value as a strategic partnership is less. I think the reality is when TPP goes, when this goes through, China's going to make money off of this because the markets are going to grow. And when the markets grow, the Chinese are a huge part of that economy, and they're going to benefit from just the increased economic activity.
Why are the Democrats opposed to this treaty?
I really feel that the Russian-Chinese relationship is significant. And I think the two of them together are leading to this real concern that some kind of unity, even closer than they are now, will lead to sort of a threatening posture against both Europe and in Asia and ultimately the United States. The Vladimir Putin, who came to power in 1999, he really was the manipulated or mastered the relationship to China that brought from basic indifference and concern and suspicion in the 90s to a really close relationship today. And I've been reading about some of the reasons why this relationship will be permanent or will be enduring. And one is that they both have a sense of success in the socialist idea of government. Now, Putin talks about the glory that was the Soviet Union. And of course, Xi Jinping rules over a communist country today. So that's one of the areas in which they have a common viewpoint.
James, Secretary Kerry, Secretary of State, was in China over the weekend, and the key item was China's massive island-building campaign and expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea. Kerry says there's a diplomatic solution. Do you see that happening?
Potentially, but not on the course that the United States is on. I think that the Chinese, I believe, are trying to rewrite the international norms in Asia, and I think the territorial claims, their goal is to not settle them through kind of the normalized equal respect and work this out. So, for example, the United States has a territorial dispute with Canada in the Arctic. We'll hammer that out. Maybe someday they'll reach an agreement, someday they won't. But the point is, it's always going to be done through kind of the international norms of negotiating that. The Chinese have chosen a different path, and I think the only way to get the Chinese back to the path of addressing those issues through kind of the international norms is for the United States has to set down some pretty serious red lines as to where it's acceptable or not. And not just the United States. I think the United States, Japan, Australia, India, there has to be, among the powers in the region, there has to be a common approach to this. And it's not about containment of China. I think the Chinese would be the first to say that it is. But it's about, look, we, the other countries that are just part of this neighborhood, have all agreed that in settling these territorial disputes, we're going to do this through the normal course of relations between countries. And if you don't do that, then there's always going to be friction there. And this is a powerful leader, and he has chosen not to that course, but he's got 10 years, so hopefully he'll change his mind.
You think China will help us in imposing further sanctions on North Korea?
Yeah, well, the red line's been well passed, Larry. In the Spratly Islands, which is in the South China Sea, China just told John Kerry over the weekend, the Chinese foreign minister, that their national interests determine that they stay in the South China Sea. And I just saw a picture on the internet this morning showing that the Chinese are building an 8-story office building on one of the coral reefs that they covered with sand and made a base in the last year. So the Chinese aren't getting out of the Spratly Islands. Now, I was recently in Vietnam and talked to one of the foreign ministry officials. They expressed concern, but they also said, well, we will start dealing with this between our brother communist power, the Chinese. The point is the Vietnamese are in no position to stop the Chinese expanse through the South China Sea.
James, do you think China will help us in imposing more sanctions on North Korea?
No. The Chinese only have one interest in North Korea, and that is to not see it collapse and be their problem. The North Korean regime is incredibly resilient. They're relatively indifferent to Chinese pressure. The Chinese have never been willing to exert real pressure on North Korea. It's a situation that we're going to have to continue to deal with until that regime collapses or goes in a very, very different direction. I think sometimes the Chinese are just as frustrated by it as we are.
Peter, in March, Mike McConnell, the former director of the National Intelligence under George W. Bush, said that the Chinese government has hacked into the computers at every major American company. How do you react to that?
Well, I think the technological war does exist today at that level. And President Obama and others in the administration have talked about the ability of the Chinese to access and America's main industries and businesses through computer sabotage. It's a reality, but it's being fought at a level in which America can hopefully summon the technology to counter this Chinese threat. But talking about the technology ability of the Chinese, they've moved on in the last few years from being just sort of a factory country to where they can now produce the most sophisticated equipment and technology. They moved way beyond what it was when, say, I first went to China in 2006. And this is a level now which makes imperative that America remain in constructive talks with China.
James, you think the United States should be more publicly outspoken against Beijing?
I think the United States should be frank and honest with Beijing, and I think that's something they would actually respect. So I think kowtowing to their sensibilities or trying to moderate your behavior based on what the Chinese are going to do, I think the most effective way to deal with China is, and a way I think China would actually appreciate, is the United States should be just up in front like the Chinese are. These are our interests. We're going to protect them, and kind of that's it. We know. I mean, I thought, for example, naming Chinese officials that were involved in espionage was good. It's going on. Everybody knows it's going on. Look, I've been hacked by the Chinese. I mean, being, I think, open and transparent about it and frank is the most effective way to have a constructive relationship with China.
Quickly, Peter, do you agree? Being open and transparent, the best way to handle this?
I would think so, sure. This is a excuse me, a new leadership in China, Xi Jinping. But while I was there in the 2006 to 2013, the previous president, Hu Jintao, and his prime minister all talked often or frequently about the future possibility of liberalizing the country, more open relationship. And I think the more contact with Chinese, the more that we have with China, the more likely it is that this whole issue could be end without conflict.
Thank you both very much. Thanks, Peter Arnett, and thanks, James J. Carafano.